Welcome to FO Talks. With me is Sebastian Schaffer again. He's the managing editor, or rather the managing director, of the Institute for the Danube region in Central Europe, in Vienna, Austria, once the capital of a great empire. And he's also the Secretary General of the Danube Rectors Conference. The Institute, IDM, as it is popularly known, is a partner of Fair Observer, and Sebastian is a regular author. Welcome, Sebastian.
Thank you very much for having me again, Atul. It's a great pleasure.
All right, Sebastian, today we are discussing Ukraine, and you have just been to Ukraine. So what is your reading of the situation?
Well, yes, it's true. It's been my second time that I have visited Ukraine since the full-scale invasion of the Russian Federation in Ukraine. And a year ago, I was in Kyiv, and it was, although for the overall situation, while I was there, while we were actually targeted with rockets at that time. This time I've been to Uzhhorod and Lviv in the western part of Ukraine, and there were no direct rocket attacks while I was there. It felt for me much more also psychologically challenging, in a sense that I can feel the toll that it takes on the population, that the war drags on, that our support from the West is very slow, that there's constantly people dying, there's constantly people being wounded, there's a constant attack of the civilian infrastructure, and this is really something that I have the feeling is wearing the people out. And I think that's also the tactic of.
So you're saying there is a drop in public morale?
No, I mean, it's a very tiny sample. What I can tell you, it's just a sense that I feel when I'm looking around, that I would say, in contrast to a year ago, where there was a certain optimism and a certain projection towards the spring offensive, that at the moment, the momentum is clearly on the side of the Russian Federation. And I feel that if I talk with people, if I see people, it's of course, the longer it takes, the more it also affects you. And for me personally, again, I have had the feeling afterwards, after the trip, that this one was much more psychologically taking a toll on me than when it was actually much more physically dangerous a year ago.
Interesting. So last year, it was physically more dangerous, but this time, psychologically, it was more draining. All right, that is in keeping with what we are hearing, what I'm hearing from people who are coming back from Ukraine. I'm meeting Ukrainians who come regularly to Washington. I met a few the other day at the National Press Club. And there certainly seems to be a drop in morale. Now, obviously, I'm further removed than you are. But one gets data points, and you said momentum is with the Russians. So the question for you is Russia likely to win? And as of now, and what does that victory look like?
I don't think that they are winning in a sense that they would be able to fully occupy Ukraine. I don't see that as a possibility, and I don't see that the morale amongst the Ukrainians.
Yeah, but again, so the second part of the question becomes important. Let's say Russia just wants what it has. Then it has achieved its war aims, and it's a victory. However, if Russia wanted to conquer the whole of Ukraine and recreate the former Soviet Union, then of course it hasn't succeeded. Now, John Mearsheimer, one of the great international relations experts, professor at University of Chicago, argues that Russia is not expansionist. Russia will take what it has and stop, and the war is a mistake. Then there are others who think that, especially Emmanuel Macron, we'll talk about him later, who think that this is the start of a new dangerous era, particular for Europe and particularly for Eastern Europe and Central Europe in the Danube region where you sit. You're rather close to it all. So your judgment, please.
So there's a lot of questions that I could answer now that you have packed in this overall.
To break it down, let's break it down. Let's begin.
Yeah. First of all, the point with winning the war in the sense that Ukraine will no longer resist. Yeah. If this is going to happen, I don't think that this is going to happen because even if this dragging on of the war takes its toll, the Ukrainians very clearly know what losing would mean, because that's destruction, that's death, that's rape. And I've seen this when I was in Irpin last year, how destruction of only a couple of weeks of Russian occupation looks like. And the people in Ukraine are very much aware of that. But now coming to the point that the Russian Federation might achieve certain goals for the time being, and then we'll see a maybe freezing of that conflict that has been going around. Here I would say, first of all, there is the only possibility to actually do that and get to a point where there would be some sort of negotiation possible, whether we like that or not, is that the Russian Federation controls what they, for themselves, believe is part of its territory since this scam referendums that have been taking place over the 4 oblasts, Kherson, Lugansk, Donetsk, and Zaporizhia. As long as they don't control all of this, I don't see how a negotiation could take place. On the other hand, how can a Ukrainian president negotiate about giving up territory? He would violate the constitution that he is sworn to defend himself. And then when it comes to, there have been several very renowned scholars in various disciplines that, for whatever reason, have taken a very interesting standpoint over the past couple of years, be it as a result of the pandemic, as suddenly scholars have become experts in the medical field and especially in pandemics. And then also when it comes to the Russian Federation, and I'm sorry to say that if we still believe that the Russian Federation is not expansionist, I think we are closing both eyes in front of reality.
I see. So John Mearsheimer's point of view is that Russia had to act because of its realpolitik aims. NATO has expanded steadily eastward. Russia sees its near abroad as a fundamental defensive bulwark against potential Western, i.e. NATO military invasion. And America would react similarly if Russia was to expand in its near neighborhood. In fact, America went ballistic, metaphorically and really, when Russia tried to expand into Cuba. So his point is, big powers act this way. This is the way the cards are dealt. Ipso facto, of course, I'm simplifying a bit, but ipso facto, Moscow is bound to be robust. But Moscow no longer plans to come to Poland. Moscow no longer plans to take over Hungary. Russia is not the ideological expansionist Soviet Union. That is his point, and I would very much like to hear what you have to say on that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's not the 1960s anymore, and what the observation back then was certainly true. But nowadays, first of all, NATO did not expand in itself, but countries asked to join NATO for a very good reason.
Also wanted to join, you could argue, Cuba wanted to join the Soviet bloc.
Yeah, sure.
And of course, the Americans responded. So that's one thing, taking it from the democratic prism, and it's another thing from the realpolitik prism. Will a big power allow an enemy power to come to its borders?
Right. So if you go in this direction, yes, and that is a point where I wanted to comment on, but still, first of all, because this, I think, words matter, especially nowadays in this field where we have a lot of narratives spun and alternative facts being created. So it's not a NATO expansion in the sense that there is someone sitting in the headquarters in Brussels and saying, where can we go next? No. NATO is a defensive alliance and countries join voluntarily. Actually, there are countries that would like to join NATO that NATO hasn't allowed in yet. And then the second part of it, when there is so much fear of countries joining NATO and bringing NATO closer to the Russian borders, why is there not a complete, as you said, going ballistic in the Kremlin since Finland and Sweden joined NATO? Because the biggest advocate of NATO enlargement is actually Moscow, because it's behaving like it does behave. And this creates the sense that a country like Sweden, who has been neutral for 200 years, throws that away and joins NATO. We have had a change in the standpoint that was upheld for 3 decades in Denmark, that had an opt-out in the Treaty of Maastricht to be not included in the common security and defense policy that was scrapped in February 2022. And now to the point, can the Russian Federation, so to say, accept that this is happening in its overall neighborhood? Well, I would say to a certain extent, at a certain point before the full-scale invasion, you could have argued that, yes, if potentially Ukraine would also join NATO, and if then rockets would be placed in Ukraine, that would fundamentally challenge the security of the Russian Federation, because they would be potentially overwhelmed by the capacity of mid and long range missiles that would be able to be stationed in new NATO territory, so to say. But could we have found a different solution than just attacking a country and now trying to spin various narratives? First of all, it was the NATO expansion, as it was called. Then it was the Nazi regime that is in Kyiv. And now we've arrived at the point where we say, well, Ukraine isn't really a country anyway, so we can do whatever we want. And this is what I'm challenging. I think there would have been a lot of potential to negotiate and to think about how could we solve that situation without the necessity of attacking Ukraine, and framing it as a preemptive necessity or something like this is simply not reality. It's simply a front that is used from the Kremlin to justify violation of international law that we have not seen on the continent since the Second World War.
So let's go back to Russian aggression. War is back in Europe. It's a big-time war. Yes, you had war in the Balkans when Yugoslavia disintegrated. But you've not had a large-scale war since 1945, since the fall of Berlin. Emmanuel Macron tried very hard to make peace. There's a famous photograph of him sitting across a long table with Putin during the COVID days, those heady days of 2022, early days, I believe. And now Macron is championing troops in Western Ukraine. He's become a big hawk on Russia. He talks about a new form of domino effect, that if Ukraine falls, then others will follow. My question to you is, will Europe get tougher with Russia?
The simple answer is Europe, no, because there's too many different sovereign states that have different approaches towards it. And additionally to that, there's also a hybrid war being fought, additionally to the one that you described, happening on the ground, which of course...
Do you mean this hybrid war is the narrative war inside various countries? We'll touch upon that because you're sitting in Vienna, and we'll talk about your region in great detail. Let's first examine Macron, and then we'll come to Germany as well.
Of course. So I think that some countries are realizing now that there's a bigger dimension overall to that, because on the one hand, as you described, that when the Russian Federation would be standing directly at borders of NATO, but also EU member countries, we would see a different kind of threat, as if there would still be countries in between the European Union and the Russian Federation. But on the other hand, I think what also is realized, and we could see this shift over the past 2 years, that if we are not able to defend the people in Ukraine who are fighting for freedom, for values that the European Union stands for, how can we actually still uphold these values? And I think this is a fundamental shift, because the overall security structure in Europe was destroyed at the latest on the 24th of February 2022, but our overall democratic way of life and our freedom and our values are fundamentally under threat. And I think the French president is beginning to realize that ultimately, if we are not enabling the Ukrainians to defend this, we will be the next who have to defend this, because we have not only Article 5 in NATO, we also have Article 42.7 in the Treaty of Lisbon.
All right, so this viewpoint has caused tensions with Germany. I hear off the record from both German and French diplomats that things are not hunky-dory. The perception in Berlin is different, given a very different history. Furthermore, a lot of Europeans do not have the will to fight. They think that the threat to Europe is exaggerated. After all, Spain and Portugal and Italy are very far away from Russia, and they've never been under Slavic rule. And the last time the Latin world clashed with the Slavic world was really 1054, when the Roman Catholic Church broke off with the Orthodox Church. So the question is this divide? How real is this divide, and is this divide likely to grow in the coming months?
Again, I would believe it's not so easily to break it down to maybe language groups or religion or even geography. I think there's a difference resulting from different party families that are dealing with the challenges, and here especially the Russian Federation. I think that, for instance, the German Social Democrats are having really trouble to arrive in this new reality, while, for instance, the Green Party has already arrived, which is
ironic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the two times.
Anyone who's followed German politics, I have. The first time I went to Berlin in 2002, that shows I'm getting old. One MP was coming out of the SPD office, and Gerhard Schröder was likely to lose in that election. And he gave me a tour of the SPD office, and I was a random foreigner. And then, of course, I met some Greens, and it was magical. I was doing philosophy, politics, and economics at Oxford in those days, and had the most magical trip of Berlin. And I came away completely in love with Germany. And of course, Schröder went on to win that election. Yada, yada. We won't go too far back into that. But the point is that at that, if you had told me then that it would be the Greens who would be more hawkish on Russia, and the SPD, would be soft. But in retrospect, even that makes sense, because Schröder was very keen on energy, cheap energy from Russia. He wanted to stimulate the economy. He bet big on labor reforms, the Hartz reforms, and cheap energy from Russia. And that was the basis of the German manufacturing success. And Germany managed to keep its manufacturing base along with northern Italy. The only two places that kept their manufacturing base in Europe. So maybe the SPD is trapped by the Schröder legacy.
Also, I think there's this historic responsibility that we should never lead a war of aggression from German soil again.
The good old German guilt.
And I mean, what we forget in this case is that we, as if we look at German history, we've not only invaded the Russian Federation in the Second World War, we've invaded the Soviet Union. And Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. And the most people in the Second World War on Soviet Union territory that died, and the most destruction that happened was actually in Ukraine and also in Belarus. So if we are trapped in this type of guilt, then we would also have a certain responsibility towards Ukraine. But this is something that is overlooked, and I don't quite understand that. But what I wanted to mention with the Green Party and the irony, I mean, the two times that they had the foreign ministry in the history of the Federal Republic of Germany, there had been fundamental shifts with regards to security and defense. And for the first time in 1999, there was an out-of-area mission of NATO. I'm speaking about the Operation Allied Force in Kosovo. And the second time the Greens have the foreign ministry in Germany, the so-called Zeitenwende is happening, and the security architecture is basically destroyed by the Russian Federation, and now we are caught up in this situation that we actually have to partake in a war, ramp up weapons production, increase export of ammunition, etc.
So let's touch upon Zeitenwende, the great speech by Olaf Scholz in the German parliament. And he talked, which literally means, a change in an era, or please correct me if I'm not translating correctly. And there was all this talk, and of course the German economy has since plummeted. Germany is under acute pressure. The AfD, which is the far-right party, Allianz für Deutschland, that's on the rise. And whilst Macron is proposing a hawkish position on Ukraine and even suggesting sending troops there, Germany doesn't want to get too involved in the aggression. There is a significant number of Germans who think that this war has done nothing but hurt German interests, because now energy costs a lot more, industry has suffered, economy has tumbled. Americans have responded by bringing in the Inflation Reduction Act, which is protectionist. And in fact, I hear from many German friends that the real losers in this war, in some ways, if you look at it in realpolitik ways, are the Germans. So there isn't the same enthusiasm for the war amongst significant sections of Germans. And the government certainly does not buy into Macron's more aggressive Russia policy. So how do you see that Franco-German split playing out?
So first of all, the split here, of course, results because we have a fundamental different political system. Well, we have a semi-presidential system in France, and it's easy for Macron as the president to say what type of policies he thinks.
Well, the president of France is still the emperor of France. He behaves almost like Napoleon even today.
Well, I don't see Macron marching towards Moscow, but
but it's a Jupiterian presidency. Everyone talks about that. He's certainly. I mean, he's been accused by his own classmates of being il est pervers narcissiste. There's too many people in France have called him a narcissistic pervert. But that is perhaps every French president.
It's not my place to judge, and to be honest, I have not that much insight into French politics to be able to judge this. But the difference that I can judge is that in Germany you have a parliamentarian system, and at the moment we have three parties that form the government coalition. And there is a difference, of course, because you will find people in the Social Democratic Party that would be maybe...
Very quickly, can I tell our listeners that unlike, say, Britain, unlike, say, the US, where you have the first past the post system and a winners take all in a constituency. So let's say you run to be a member of parliament in Yorkshire, and you get 34% of the vote, and the rest of the vote is divided amongst the Conservatives, the Liberals, and the Conservatives get 33.9% of the vote. The MP, the Member of Parliament of that constituency, will be the Labour Party person who wins the maximum votes. In contrast, Germany has proportional representation, which means that parties get number of seats in Parliament depending on the percentage of votes they get, as long as they cross a certain threshold. So the same voting pattern would result in Labour Party getting, if it was a national vote share, would getting 34% of the seats, and the Conservatives would get 33.9% of the seats, and the seats of Parliament would be divvied up accordingly. This means that the German Parliament is naturally more fractured than, say, the United States House of Congress or the British Parliament, or even the Indian Parliament. I think that is very important for listeners and viewers to understand. Sebastian, over to you. I just wanted to get that in because a lot of our audience lives in the Anglo-Saxon world and is influenced by Anglo-Saxon systems, even if it's not Anglo-Saxon, such as India.
It's even a mixed system. It becomes more complicated. Maybe we need to do a separate call on that.
Yeah, maybe we need to explain the different systems.
So at the moment, the German government is comprised of three parties. We already mentioned the Social Democrats, we mentioned the Green Party, but also the Liberals.
Yes.
And so there's a
traffic light coalition. Red-green
coalition is what we call
yellow.
it.
Please explain that as well.
It's red for the Social Democrats, yellow for the Liberals, and green for the Greens. And that resembles a traffic light. So the challenge that we find here is that you will find hawkish people in the Social Democrats. You will find maybe negotiationists in the Liberals, and you will find both also in the Green Party. It's a matter of finding a compromise here, and that of course makes it much more challenging, especially when it comes to finding a common policy. Now, you rightly described that there is, of course, a certain clash. The German Chancellor comes from the Social Democrats. Macron comes from a liberal party. But at least, as far as I read, they spent 1st of May together having dinner. And
Labor Day.
Some talks going on. And it was apparently not about the Russian Federation. It was rather about China. But this is also, of course, a factor in the overall situation that we find in Ukraine at the moment.
Okay, so we've covered a bit about the Franco-German divide, and you sound a bit more optimistic than some of my friends. Let's talk about your region. Hungary has Viktor Orban, and Viktor Orban is seen as more pro-Russia. He's seen as friendly to Russian President Vladimir Putin. Slovakia has Robert Fico, and you mentioned hybrid war. So paint us a picture of what's going on in your region. How are the inclinations of various countries different? And also a bit of color about Orban, Fico. I know I've asked you to do a lot, but you're the expert on the region, and I'm sure you can simplify it for us.
So,
and not simplify, make sense of it for us.
So I'm going to try. So what we find is a very different set of threat perception, which is on the one hand maybe also historical, but on the other hand also certainly a result of that hybrid war. So you mentioned Orban, you mentioned Fico. We should also talk about probably Donald Tusk in Poland.
Yes, of course.
These countries are neighboring countries of Ukraine and would be directly affected if the Russian Federation would actually occupy the whole of Ukraine in this war of aggression. Viktor Orban is a very peculiar case. I think it's strange to see such a transformation, and it's still unclear how that transformation is really to be explained. If you look at statements that Viktor Orban has done in 2008, where he was not prime minister, he was prime minister before he lost an election. At that time, he was not prime minister. He was condemning the war of the Russian Federation against Georgia that was happening in August 2008. When he came to power 2 years later and has been staying in power ever since, there has been a transformation also towards the Russian Federation. And you could find explanations, and you will probably know more a couple of decades after when you get access to certain documents maybe. But one thing is that Viktor Orban, of course, finances his success and his a change of the political system in Hungary through, for instance, having cheap gas prices subsidized by the government. And it's no secret that there is a long-term contract with Gazprom from the Russian Federation. You see also now that Gazprom, after no longer being able to sponsor the Champions League, they are now sponsoring Viktor Orban's hometown club, where you could also question what the sense behind it is. So what I'm hinting...
How very convenient.
Yeah. So what I'm hinting is that I think there's a certain factor that is non-ideologically, but this is simply rooted in
self-interest, plain old-fashioned self-interest.
Because if you look at the history of Hungary, in '56, the memory of being invaded by the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact troops coming to Budapest, is something that used to be a pillar of modern days understanding of fighting for Hungarian sovereignty. And Viktor Orban is basically betraying this, but it seems to be accepted for whatever reason.
But to that, Hungarians say that at that time, Ukraine was a part of the Soviet Union too. And there is Hungarian territory in Ukraine and Hungarian speakers in Ukraine. And a lot of the tank commanders were Ukrainian in 1956. And furthermore, Hungary has always viewed itself as separate from both the Germanic parts of Germanic neighbors to the west and the Slavic neighbors to the east. And they think it's a Slavic civil war. Why should they get involved?
Yes, and you're hinting to the Zakarpattia region, where we have a Hungarian-speaking minority there, and of course there have been challenges for the minority also in recent history. And I don't want to deny that, but I mean the overall thing.
I'm just relaying to you what I hear from the Hungarians.
No.
I don't know the region enough, so I want you to educate us.
I'm simply, you will. I mean, the beauty of having these type of conversations is that we, of course, will. I have not the complete truth, and the people that you have been talking to don't have it either.
Yes.
There's shades of gray in every political decision making, and also resulting in sometimes very ambiguous results. But I mean, the overall point is that the aggression was there. Budapest has been, so to say, invaded in '56. Their aspirations towards democracy have been crushed. And that sounds awfully familiar, if you ask me, if we look at what is happening right now in Ukraine. And then I'm not really convinced by the argument that we should be making deals with the Kremlin just because maybe a tank driver in '56 will speak in Ukrainian. I'm oversimplifying, but I mean...
understood. So you've explained... sorry, finish, please, yeah.
The overall point would be to say, okay, if I am really that ambiguous to that development, at least I'm not supporting then one side. Then if I want to be neutral, then I get out of this. But on the one hand, support for Ukraine is vetoed. On the other hand, deals with Gazprom are made. This is something that I don't really understand.
Okay, but you've already explained it. So you've explained Hungary. what about Robert Fico? What about the others? The other smaller countries in your region? What are the varying levels of threat perceptions? What is their position?
In Slovakia, we could see a very interesting development because the current prime minister has been voted out of office due to a situation that was clear that there was a very mafia type of style of government being in place, resulting in, for instance, being a journalist and his two journalists, husband and wife, being killed. And that
You're talking about the earlier upheaval against Robert Fico.
Yes.
But now he's back in power. He's been re-elected.
He's been re-elected, and on the one hand, it's astonishing to see how short-lived memory of a population can be, because I mean that he's able to come back and make this comeback out of the things that have been uncovered and out of the stir it caused that these two journalists have been mafia-style murdered because they were about to uncover certain financial flows that have been going on, including the government at that time, where Robert Fico was part of. But how did he do that? He played with sentiments and fears towards that war in Ukraine, that Slovakia could be dragged into this, that the people are losing wealth, things that you've described for the German economy, where I would be wondering, again, is the reason the support of Ukraine that this is happening, that the energy prices are rising, that we have inflation? Or is the reason not sitting in the Kremlin because a Russian dictator had nothing better to do than, after a global pandemic, to also start the biggest war on European soil since 1945, as you have correctly described it? So asking the other way around, if we have peace tomorrow, whatever that would look like, I don't want to debate about this, because the only peace that I find just is if the Russian Federation leaves Ukraine and they are restoring their sovereignty in their borders of 1991. But if miraculously something would happen, peace would return, do people really think that inflation is going to go away, that energy prices are going to drop, that we will just go back to 2019? No, the world has changed for a couple of reasons, but it's of course always easy to blame it on a single factor. And in this case, I think this was a reason why Robert Fico was able to come back into government. And in Poland, for instance, while we have quite a divide along party lines on how the country should position itself within the European Union, and we have a clear return to upholding European values with the new government of Donald Tusk, there's absolutely a shared analysis of the threat that comes from the Russian Federation, which is a I would say a broad majority, not only within the population but also within the political parties, that say if we are not stopping the Kremlin in Ukraine, we will have to stop them again on our territory, because they are not going to stop. They will invade sooner or later.
And the Poles have good reason to fear the Russians. They have a long history of being overrun by Russian armies. Do you think there's a possibility they could go nuclear? Because if they have nuclear weapons, that's their only deterrence, their only real deterrence, frankly, against Russia.
Well, you can never rule out anything, but I find it very unlikely. Why? First of all, we've seen these threats returning and returning, but there's no indication that anything like this would be a real option at the moment. The reason also being, what would be the minute that a nuclear warhead is launched towards a NATO member country? I'm pretty sure that whatever the US administration would look like, there will be a retaliation.
Well, I mean, no, the Russians could take a little bit of Polish territory. They may not go nuclear, but if Poland was nuclear, the Russians wouldn't dare. That's the deterrence argument.
Right. Okay. So I thought you were asking if the Russian Federation would use nuclear weapons.
No. I was asking if Poland acquires nuclear weapons, because I've heard arguments from certain Polish thinkers that Poland should have its own nuclear deterrent.
I think the overall point would be that probably we would need a nuclear deterrence independent from the United States. That would be something that would really be necessary. Also, with regards to a possibility of a US administration abandoning NATO,
that's something very significant coming from a German based in Austria. You are telling me that the Europeans will need their own independent nuclear deterrent. That is really the Charles de Gaulle point of view. He actually took France out of NATO. So you very much fall in the Charles de Gaulle, Emmanuel Macron point of view, that Europeans need to now build their own security, have their own nuclear deterrent, and invest in both their militaries and defense production.
Absolutely. I mean, there's various degrees to it again, but look, it's fairly simple in that sense. At the moment, we will not be able to guarantee, without the NATO framework, and here especially then the United States being part of it, that Article 42.7 of the Treaty of Lisbon can actually be guaranteed. And that.
So you're relying on NATO Article 5, really?
Yeah. Because I don't see that we would be able to defend without the help of the United States, for instance, whatever Ukraine that would be joining the European Union. But I'm also afraid that there is not enough possibility to actually also fulfill that obligation if, for instance, the Russian Federation would decide to attack a Baltic country.
I see. So finally, tell us about the other countries. We've talked about Slovakia. We've talked about Hungary, of course. We talked first about Hungary, then Slovakia, and then Poland. And I see on the lovely map behind you that there are more than 3 countries in the region you cover, sir. So how do these other countries view? Where do they fall? Are they more towards Poland? Are they more towards Hungary? Are they more towards Slovakia? It would be great to have a brief picture, because historically this region has been the region where the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire jostled for influence, and it was actually Gavrilo Princip's shot that set off World War I back in 1914.
Yeah. So I would say we have 3 sets of countries. Countries that are very much aware and have been warning about the threat that is coming out of the Russian Federation. Poland would be part of that, but I would also say that the Baltic states fall into this category. We have countries that are, for whatever reason, trying to avoid being dragged into this, some sort of neutrality is not the point, because the Austrian neutrality is a very different concept of that was what is advocated by Orban and Fico. So I wouldn't put Austria in the same basket as those countries completely. But of course, there's a certain tendency to say, okay, it's not something that we should get involved, and we should not be part of it. Austria here very clearly states, the Austrian government very clearly states that neutrality doesn't mean that they cannot support Ukraine in other ways. You know, they're not sending military equipment, but they're sending humanitarian aid, they're sending money, and neutrality doesn't necessarily mean that they need to be neutral when it comes to upholding values. So, and then a third set of countries that Austria, in a sense, also falls into here is countries that have to learn that the new reality will mean that we have to have a different approach towards the Russian Federation, and that regardless of how the situation will develop, regardless what the war, how that war of aggression will end, we will have, for the considerable future, and I'm talking about probably the next decade at least, insecurity in our direct neighborhood, and we need to adapt to it. Because if Ukraine falls and the Russian Federation is at the border of Poland, of Slovakia, etc., there will be constant threats towards those countries, and they will have to live and deal with that. If we have a frozen conflict and some negotiated peace, I guarantee you that this will only be a interwar period, and the Russian Federation will become aggressive at the next possible opportunity, which means, again, insecurity. And if Ukraine, which of course would be my preferred scenario, would be able to drive the Russian Federation out of their country, this will mean that there will be considerable disintegration in the Russian Federation, which could lead up to a civil war. And as a result, again, instability, volatility in our direct neighborhood. So regardless what happens, we need to understand and we need to prepare for that. And there's countries who have understood that. There's countries who need to come to terms and start understanding. France, I think, has begun. Germany is on its way. Austria has probably a longer way. And then there's countries which are in the European Union, Slovakia, Hungary, but also outside of the European Union, Serbia, the Republika Srpska in Bosnia and Herzegovina, who are rooting for a continuation of this uncertainty on the European continent and try to benefit from whatever comes out of this, but will ultimately understand that you cannot prosper and you cannot develop in this type of insecurity. And hopefully, at the end, it will also prove that they have been on the wrong side of history at the end of this.
All right, on that extremely comprehensive summing up, thank you very much, Sebastian, for making the time. Always a pleasure to talk to you. We'll have you back to talk about the European elections. We'll also talk about what the EU decides on Ukraine. We'll have you back regularly. Those of you who don't know about IDM, who live in India, who live in the US, who live even in the UK, believe it or not, post-Brexit UK, you should check IDM out. and of course, indeed, all our viewers in different countries around the world. Thank you, and see you soon.
Thank you so much. Always a pleasure, and can't wait to be back. Thank you, Artur. All the best.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.